So we'll get started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the GML webinar this evening on the value of history. I'm Helen Doyle and I'm an associate and historian at Context, which is part of the GML Heritage Group. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the many parts of Australia we are meeting from tonight, including Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra, and elsewhere across Australia. We pay our respect to all their elders, past and present. I would particularly like to welcome any Aboriginal people who are joining us this evening. At GML in Context, we recognise and value the rich and integral contribution Aboriginal history and heritage makes to our cities and regions. I'm speaking to you from Melbourne tonight, traditional country of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us, and thank you for registering for this webinar to mark New South Wales History Week, and including a special welcome to our colleagues from outside of Australia, which is exciting. They can join us too. I'm joined this evening by my colleagues at GML Sydney and Canberra, including Patrick Atkinson in Sydney.
Hello.
Hi, Patrick. Lara Tooby in Canberra. Hi, Lara. And Leonie Masson in Sydney.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Leonie. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. Everybody should be on mute, just for sound quality, so please stay on mute until the end of the speakers' presentations. We'll have the three speakers presenting, and then we'll be followed by some questions, which you're welcome to add to our chat box. You can see the chat box at the bottom of the screen there. Please feel free to add any comments as well, hopefully positive comments, and any questions you have that arise throughout presentations. The subject of the value of history in heritage practice is a big topic for a relatively short time slot tonight. But what we hope to do in this session is to present some examples and reflections of the work being done at GML in Context where history is integral, and to reflect on the process and the outcomes or potential outcomes of this work. Work of history, apparently an area not particularly valued in the federal government's new university funding model, is in fact a quiet, critical player in the shaping of our future towns and cities, and in giving voice to communities and individuals with important but sometimes forgotten stories to tell, and in contributing to the broader debate about culture and identity. Right now in Melbourne, and indeed throughout the world, where life is fairly grim, there's a strange sense that we are in fact living at a time that will be in the future an important time in history. As an historian, it is somewhat surreal to consider that we are part of a significant episode that may one day be interpreted. At the same time, in our work as historians, we are drawing on the stories of the past to inform present day realities, be they planning outcomes or interpretation strategies, perhaps inspired place name for a new residential precinct. It's very much an integration and sometimes something of a collision of the past and the present in our work, and it is the work of looking forwards, it is the work of looking backwards to look forwards that very much informs what we do. Work of history and heritage practice is certainly challenging. It needs to be mindful of the politics and the sensitivities associated with many of the projects we work on, and the sense that the outcomes of today are different from what they might have been 10 or 20 years ago, and that they will indeed continue to be adapted to the needs of the present. There's always new baggage emerging from the past that needs sorting. There are layers of meanings and stories and diverse voices clamouring to be heard. So there's a need for scrutiny, careful consideration, measured reflection in what we do to bring the stories of the past into the present. This is the challenge: seek meaningful outcomes, sit well in the present, and hopefully for some time in the future. So without further from me, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Patrick Atkinson. Patrick is an early career historian, GML in Sydney, and is a heritage consultant in the Sydney office, having begun just 1.5 years ago. Patrick is also an associate member of the PHA of New South Wales and the ACT, and works in a dual capacity as historian and heritage consultant at GML, having trained as an historian during his bachelor degree and specialised in heritage during postgrad studies at the ANU. So thank you, Patrick, over to you.
Thank you, Helen, and welcome to everybody. Just a little background about myself in addition to that. I've always had a lifelong interest in history from a young age. I'm sure younger members of the audience probably remember the horrible history books. I was an avid reader of those and consumed them en masse, and that certainly inspired me to kind of seek a career in history or heritage further down the line. I'd just like to start by saying, I studied history as an undergraduate, and I found it immensely valuable. And in fact, I continue to find it immensely valuable working at GML as a heritage consultant, being able to engage in history and presenting history to people. I'm also very disappointed with the government's planned changes to the fee structure of degrees at university. I'm sure it's echoed by many people in the audience, but I feel it'll prevent people, choosing to study history, to the detriment of our understanding of the past in Australia. It's something which may only be felt, in the future. My decision to start a career in heritage was partly because I saw it as a way of engaging with history, but also because I saw it as a way to engage people with history. As we're all aware, history is a very broad term. It covers many different types of history, each with their own approach, values, and goals. In my personal experience, I see the value of history as about how it can inform us about the lived experience of other people, even through great swaths of time. I think people value history. The value of history statement put out by the History Councils of New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria, and WA last year lists 7 key reasons why 7 different values that history has, one of which is identity, and I feel as if that's possibly one of the strongest ones. History shapes our identities and is a foundation for future generations' identities. Coming from the perspective of someone at the beginning of my career, I feel as if people are interested in engaging with history, but not everyone is interested in reading about history. People also seek experiences, and people seek authentic experiences. Navigating the two of those, I feel, is probably one of the key challenges to effectively communicating the value of history. Now, historical places and historical objects have authenticity. They have a sense of authenticity. To be cliche, I can talk about the Mona Lisa. It's something which is probably better viewed online in far more detail than you could see it through the crowds in the Louvre, but that doesn't stop people going every single year to the Louvre to visit the Mona Lisa in person. There's a kind of awe around objects, which is like this, which is an experience in of itself, and it adds to the value of those objects. And the same applies to places, but it's not just limited to places. It's also the stories, events, and people which have that kind of aura and have that kind of experience. And in some ways, people probably find it easier to relate to the past when it is communicated through people, which is, the stories and events and the persons who make places. History, in some senses, is an exercise in empathy. Now, communicating history doesn't have to be a blockbuster experience to communicate or to create value. The examples I want to talk about aren't big things like the Mona Lisa, but they do communicate history, I feel, very effectively, and most importantly, communicate its value. The first of which is on the corner of Fletcher Street and Small Street in Woollahra. It's a one of my favorite examples of heritage interpretation. It's a small plaque, small, unassuming and succinct. But, you know, I feel as if it brings you immediately into the past and makes you consider the event that happened. It's about the Japanese bombardment of Sydney on the 8th of June, 1942. About 15 miles off the coast, a Japanese sub surfaced, fired 10 shells, one of which landed outside of this building. The shell exploded, causing damage to the building itself. Luckily, no one was injured. However, it did create a small crater, and the upstairs occupants, the owners of the grocery store, Stanley and Alice Richards, were thrown from the beds by the force of the explosion. Now, walking down Fletcher Street these days, you'd have no idea that this event happened on the corner right by that building. In fact, I walked down the street many times without actually noticing this plaque, which was put there in 2014 by Woollahra Council, until one day I stumbled upon it, and I was immediately transported back to 1942 and to the sense of fear and dread of an impending Japanese invasion. Fear and dread that apparently isn't shared by the children back then. As you can see in that photo, they're playing in the crater that the explosive made. This is an example of communicating history in a way which I think adds value to a place without dominating it and elicits an emotional response. It also promotes curiosity. The other example I'd like to talk about are stolperstein, or stumbling blocks. These people in the audience might be familiar with these. They're found throughout Europe, but they're small brass plates which list the names and life dates of people who were victims of Nazi extermination and persecution, and they're placed outside of their former houses and workplaces. These started as an art project in 1992 by an artist called Gunther Denmig, and they've taken on a life of their own now. There's as of December 2019, there's over 75,000 of these throughout Europe. They're grim reminders of a dark aspect of the past. They're confronting, they do elicit an emotional response. And their relationship to the place is not represented in the physical fabric, but is communicated through the stumbling blocks themselves. I think this is an example of how history of a place can be successfully used to communicate an aspect of the past that's not embodied in the fabric, which in some senses is a durable and future-proofed way of presenting and communicating history, something which has ongoing value as time progresses. People value the past. I think it's important that history speaks to them and is relatable to them, which often means eschewing larger stories to speak about something that, you know, is personal and relates to them. These two examples, I think, show that presenting history doesn't have to be burdensome or grand. At GML, my experience, you know, we work with history to find the stories that are not necessarily embodied in the fabric, to communicate the value of places beyond their, you know, physicality. And engaging with history, even in small ways this way, can create better places and can create value for people. And it's, in my opinion, that, you know, history is best done the service by communicating the experiences of people. I'd just like to finish by mentioning that one of the 7 values listed in the Value of History statement is economic development, saying people are drawn to communities with a strong sense of historical identity, material heritage, and culture. Cultural heritage is a demonstrated economic asset. I think that rings true for places in Sydney and around Australia. And I feel as if engaging with history and communicating the stories that aren't necessarily present in the fabric is a way of creating value, value which is ongoing and can be, you know, durable to the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick, for that. It's a great start for our webinar. Really enjoyed your reflections, your personal reflections on the meaning of heritage and history, and the examples that you've presented. We're going to move on to our second speaker, Lara, who is with GML in Canberra. And Lara has been with GML for 5 years, almost 5 years. She has a background in archaeology, completing a Bachelor of Arts in 2016. Currently, she is working part-time in the Canberra office. She had been in the Sydney office, while she's completing a Master's in Archaeological Science at the ANU. Lara will be arguing this evening, archaeological remains and stories can connect the broader community to the past. Thanks very much. Over to you, Lara.
Thank you, Helen. Hi, everyone. So the primary aim of this webinar tonight is discussing how to communicate the value of history to different audiences. And to be honest, I do not have all the answers yet. And I'm not even in the position where I can make huge decisions on communicating historical ideas. I'm not even a historian with a capital H. However, I do work in cultural heritage as an archaeologist, and history is embedded in everything I do, and it gives my work meaning. So this evening, I will briefly discuss how I believe archaeological remains and stories together can communicate history. The arts degree subjects that are now demonised in the media as not job relevant launched me into a career as a consultant archaeologist. Kind of. I mean, a lot of my work has been learned on the go. I'm conscious that some people listening in to this might be university students currently doing history, looking at careers, maybe thinking, is archaeology for me? What is it like? Well, it's a bit like being a historian, except rather than just identifying what is important and historical, some people say you have to go and dig it up with medieval tools. Whilst construction workers around you work within air-conditioned 13 to 37 tonne excavators, you'll be handed a trowel too small for even Bunnings warehouse to sell, and a garden spade, hoe, mattock, and bucket. You'll be there in the trench thinking, maybe I should have just been an armchair historian, smoke a pipe, wear some tweed, and then suddenly, whilst pulling back armfuls of mud in an asbestos suit, you identify a brick. This brick has been hand moulded by local clay. It is crude and badly made. Knowing your local history, you realise that the person that made that brick was not a professional. They were a convict who had been set to work on a government building program. And as you clean the mud off that brick for a split second, 200 years collapse. You are holding something made by an individual from the past, entrenched in their own life problems, surrounded by their own worldviews and moral compass. Such collapses of time can often happen to people visiting historical sites. I'm sure you would have experienced this in some way or another, walking through a site holding an artefact, even seeing a moving exhibit at a local war memorial. Although I wouldn't suggest it's time travel, archaeological remains, if attached to a story, can immerse you within the past. Doing fieldwork and experiencing this, you may stop pining over an armchair and become fond of your trowel as a little spoon that sweeps back layers of time. I believe there is inherent historical value in archaeological remains, which can be communicated through stories. It is amazing how fast a place can go from meh to whoa, as long as it is attached to a story. I'll give you an example now. I played a very small role in the Ride Heritage Review project, championed by my amazing colleague, Lisa. The project was undertaken during a period of significant development within the Ride area, giving the work a certain urgency to give local heritage sites statutory protection under the LEP. I looked at 2 archaeological sites, one of them being 20 Waterview Street, Putney, and it's about to be shown on the slide. My task was to draft a heritage inventory form of the property for council consideration. I found that somewhere on the property, probably beneath the industrial buildings, is the Malting Shovel Inn, brewery and wharf, established by emancipist convict James Squire. You would recognise the name James Squire, as it is splashed on the bottles of the self-titled beer that exists today and seen on the slide. I apologise to all the people who know this story, but I certainly didn't until I worked on the project. Today I'm going to share the value of this site with you through a story. James Squire, or what we know of him in the historic record, is a bit of a convict icon. Born in 1754 at Kingston upon Thames, he was transported to Australia on the First Fleet in 1788, separated from his wife Martha and 3 children. This was not even his first deportation. When he was 20, authorities for his, he was caught and charged with highway robbery. He was sentenced to be transported to America as a convict for 7 years, but he shortened his sentence by serving the army in the American Revolutionary War. Squire began brewing beer for his personal consumption as soon as he arrived in Australia. To do so, he stole a herb that imitated the flavour of hops from a local hospital store, and when caught, he was given 150 lashes of the whip, hence the name of the beer. By 1792, when James Squire was 38 years old, his convict sentence had expired. The enterprising man, besides running farms, bakeries, butchers, and becoming district constable, opened the Malting Shovel Inn and wharf on the banks of the Parramatta River. In this way, he operated the first commercial brewery in New South Wales, an incredibly important stopping place along the Parramatta River. Squire struck a relationship with the first Aboriginal statesman, Bennelong, who needs no introduction. While there is no evidence to explain how Bennelong and Squire first met, historians surmise that Bennelong regularly wandered on to the brewer's property, and that over time the pair became such good friends that he later lived on the land. When Bennelong died in 1813, he was buried on one of Squire's properties around Kissing Point, with evidence that Squire personally buried his friend and later erected a plaque in his honour. Bennelong's brother and mother are also reported to have been buried on Squire's lands. The location of Bennelong's grave is believed to be 25 Watson Street in Putney, although the exact location of the burial remains disputed by historians. Squire passed away 9 years later in 1822 at the age of 67. Testament to the generosity of this pioneer, his funeral was reportedly the biggest funeral ever held in the colony to that time. Although the Squire's Inn, brewery and wharf were subsequently demolished, evidence of the complex may remain under the current industrial building at 20 Waterview Street. The site potential to yield archaeological information about early brewing practices and the habits of the people, the site has potential, and the habits of the people that frequented the inn. With stories about Squire and Bennelong attached to the site, archaeological remains on the property are imbued with a time-compressing value, helping to evoke the story of Squire and the circumstances that led to his extraordinary life. A brick without a story is just a brick. Archaeological remains and their histories have an inherent value as long as people feel connected to and engage with the associated stories. James Squire made the most of his circumstances by learning to adapt and thrive in the chaos life threw at him. All the while, he was generous to the people around him, even those who were from different walks of life. It is a great story and something relevant to the times we are living through in 2020. This is the story I would tell about 20 Waterview Street if interpretation works are planned for the site in the future. The heritage inventory sheet, which has made Squire's Brewery a draft heritage item on the Ryde LEP, can now be viewed online through Ryde Heritage Council. The inventory sheet was a small step into what will hopefully feed into more work on promoting the significance of the site. So in answer to the topic of the discussion on how to communicate the value of history to different audiences, I would say that although one size does not fit all, using the combination of archaeological remains and the presentation of stories associated with them allows the general public to engage with history and find value in the human past in the present. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lara. That was a really engaging presentation about such an important story of early Sydney, and I think there's so much there in that account, and so much reverberates into the present and into the way that we think about heritage. So moving on to our third and final speaker this evening, Leonie Masson in Sydney. Leonie trained as a librarian and worked for 25 years in public libraries in Sydney, mainly at the Stanton Library in North Sydney, where she was fortunate to work in the Historical Services team. Here she looked after local studies, council archives, 2 small community museums, organised exhibitions and ran walking tours. So she obviously developed a great passion for history during that time. Then, since 2010, Leonie has worked as an historian within the heritage consultancy field, and in March this year, she joined GML team. So thank you, Leonie, and over to you.
Thanks, everyone. I'm really interested in the talks that Patrick and Lara have presented ahead of me. I have a very different trajectory in the field of history. I never imagined I would ever use, as Lara says, the big H historian role, and I proudly write that on my passport these days, on my documents when I'm leaving the country. As Helen explained, I come from the library field, and I actually ended up in local studies and history in an accidental way when our local history librarian decided to leave. And before she left, she said they offered me the chance to work with the collection. And in the 25 years that I worked at the library, I know that's a very long time for anyone to spend in one job, but I spent so much time and loved the role so much, which is why I've come out of it with a really great appreciation of the resources that have survived and are extant that we use in the telling of stories, telling of place, communicating history, and providing for the sustaining history for future generations. And it's that wealth of information, even at the local level, that actually is the basis of most of the work we put out, even at, in any heritage consultancy field or in the history field. So at North Sydney, I developed a love of telling the local stories through exhibitions and displays. I was able to solicit material from the local community that perhaps had disappeared into someone's family photo albums. And I really enjoyed running walking tours, because this is a really important way of telling those stories of place, talking about the development of an area, talking about the people that contributed to the landscape that we see today, and perhaps what parts of that landscape have disappeared over time, and what developments and themes and events have resulted in those changes. So I came out of that 25 years and I got the chance to work in heritage consultancy field in an architectural firm, and in 2010. And so since 2010, I've been working as a historian, providing site histories, thematic histories, interpretational material for heritage consultancy jobs across the state, primarily in Sydney. And one of the areas that I've absolutely enjoyed working on, and I've produced countless histories, hundreds of histories for a range of buildings running from domestic to hotel to commercial to educational to landscape elements, comes out of my love of Art Deco pubs. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that loves the old Art Deco pubs. And pubs have a real connection with Australians, and many of us have connection with our locals. I'm sure except in this COVID era, we've been regular imbibers at our local, and we recognise them in the landscape. And the buildings are distinctive and they convey significance to a local community, not just in terms of what they provide in terms of entertainment or social value, but they're significant items architecturally and aesthetically. And the pubs of the 1930s, built by Tooth and Company, Tui's, that litter the landscape. Every suburb has at least one pub, every town has more than one pub. They're surrounded the railway station, they're in important locations in the town. This particular one that has up on the screen is one that I came across when I worked at North Sydney. It's a particularly good example. It's the Kirabili Hotel. It's actually just down opposite the railway station. And actually it's the result of not just liquor licensing change, but it's also resulting from significant developmental change in North Sydney. It came in the aftermath of the building of the Sydney Harbour Bridge and wide sort of large-scale resumption of property to build the railway line. And this pub started as another building called the Dines Hotel on the other side of the railway station at Wilson's Point. And there was a photo, you can see the photo down below, the October 1930 picture. And it has more than one story, and it tells more than one story, not just architecturally, but in terms of the developmental history of North Sydney. And it was built in 1937. It was designed by some well-known Sydney architects called Justelius and Frederick. It was built for Tui's Limited. And it, as you can see, it's a streamlined form, has a flat roof, and it owes much to European modernism and the prevailing sort of architectural style in that mid to late 1930s period. So I think in terms of what I provided for the client, I think we had an architect at the time and they were working for the owners of the pub. They were interested in this building. They wanted to retain it. They wanted to preserve the important elements of the building that the public appreciated, but they also wanted to make some internal alterations and modifications to meet sort of new standards of pub design and client comfort and liquor licensing. And so inside they've put in some interpretation on one of the walls. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of that, but this lovely architectural plan on the top left we have in colour, and that fortunately comes from the North Sydney Library's Local Studies collection. And it's an enduring means of people engaging with the past, engaging with where the history of North Sydney has arisen from significant local events, the Great Depression, economic rebuilding in the wake of the Depression and the building of the bridge. And it's a continuing symbol of how people occupy our landscape. So the pub histories, which I've been privileged to contribute to, number many. This is just one example. And they are important for us in terms of valuing our history. And for me, it's in the resources and it's in the sustaining these buildings for the future. It's about retaining buildings with a continuing use, in this case, maintaining a continuity of use as a pub. Some of the old uses, for instance, with accommodation that used to be on the first floors, those have disappeared. There's now gambling rooms, and some of the spaces like the long bars that were a result of the 6 o'clock closing have been removed. But I think internally and mostly externally, these buildings still sort of evoke that 1930s glamorous Art Deco period. And we're trying to meet the continuing needs of the owners to maintain the buildings in line with current licensing and regulatory requirements. So for me, returning back to the question of what's important about history and what do we value about history, for me, because of my past as a librarian looking after the local studies materials, looking after those resources that are held in the community, whether they've been a library or a local historical society, whether they be in a state library, whether they be in a museum. To me, it's about valuing the documents and the importance of retaining those documents and to be able to use them to actually tell those stories in a physical way as much as in a sort of an emotive way. So people will respond to the pub. They may not understand why they respond to a pub, apart from the very obvious after effects of maybe a few, But I think if we didn't have those pubs, we didn't have that physical manifestation of the design and the response to the themes of that era and to the events of those eras, we wouldn't have them. And so for me, value is the documents, it's maintaining those documents, using those documents, and keeping pubs as pubs, keeping those Art Deco pubs, keep enjoying those pubs. And that's it for me, thank you.
Thanks very much, Leonie. Thanks for sharing your personal journey as an historian with us, and the wonderful pubs of Sydney. In Melbourne, we are rather deprived at the moment and would love to go out to a pub. So looking forward to that happening one day again. Thanks again to the three of you for your wonderful presentations. We can now move to some questions from our audience. And I'm just having a look at... Okay, I have a question from Julian in Sydney. He says, thanks for the presentations and insight. How do you think different communities value history and heritage differently, and how does history influence their interaction with it? And by the way, to everybody out there, please feel free to add some comments to the chat if you have something to contribute as the questions come up. So would either of any of you like to respond to Julian's question about different communities valuing history and heritage differently? And I suppose this comes to point of the subjectivity of history and the many varied layers of meaning, significance that we constantly dealing with. It's complicated. Has that come up for any of you in any of the projects that you have been working on recently?
I'd just like to jump in and talk to that question a little bit. I mean, you know, different communities obviously value different things, and I think a point I was trying to make in my spiel was that you have to talk to their experiences. And so, as Lara said, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to communicating history and communicating history through heritage. Different communities, you know, they value different aspects of history, and so you have to communicate the history differently. How that actually, you know, influences their interactions with history, well, it's all part of, I suppose, an approach which is kind of inclusive but also diverse. I feel as if, you know, the history and historians has been moving for quite a while to, you know, including voices which haven't previously been heard. And I feel as if that makes, you know, it makes for better history, it makes for stronger communities, but it also allows people from, you know, communities that might have not been, you know, I suppose the part of the overarching culture to start, you know, connecting to their past and gaining value through that.
Yeah, further to that, Patrick, I think we have to acknowledge that our community is quite a broad range of people, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different ages, different cultural backgrounds. And I think we can't be prescriptive about how we interpret the history. We have to be able to offer some suggested ways of, and multiple ways of actually making history accessible and interpreting place. So bringing in the stories of other people in a different way. So we might have the physical fabric, we might have interpretational plaques, we might have oral history, we might look at using tablets and using phone device techniques. We might look at different language interpretation. But I think for instance, with pubs, people value them very differently. So some people don't actually see them as an aesthetic response to a period of time and events. They just appreciate being able to go in and have a drink, join their friends and chat, whereas other people do appreciate the fact that we've retained, and councils and organisations have listed these buildings as heritage items. So we have that physical manifestation of what's important architecturally. So I think we have to offer different ways of allowing people to read the environment and read place.
Yeah, thanks, Leonie. And I think too, just to add to that, there's the notion that why people and communities value those places can continually adapt, and new opportunities that will continually evolve, and to encourage, I suppose, those uses that fit with the heritage fabric, and then it's a positive outcome as well. I've got another question. This one comes from Karen Veal, so it's just coming to me from a different device. And so Sharon says, history is not necessarily broadly valued in Australia. It has had serious implications for Indigenous Australians. How do you think we can get closer to truth-telling through history and grow public engagement and the appreciation of history? This, I suppose, touches a little bit, Lara, on what you talked about, the early Sydney story. It has implications now in so much of what we do.
Yeah. So I think Australian history, the story hasn't been, well, I don't know about you guys, but when I was at school, and I never found Australian history interesting because it wasn't really taught in an engaging way. And then I went to university and it was taught to me in an engaging way. And I was absolutely hooked. I couldn't get enough. So I couldn't work out why all of a sudden it was interesting to me when before it hadn't been. And I think it's the way it's taught. So I think at the moment there's this whole move on. It's in the past attitude, but we haven't even really properly, well, we're just starting to with local historians, but especially the complexity of Aboriginal and European engagements, we're just really unravelling all the complexity of that. And until that complexity is completely unravelled, it's really hard for people to just move on, especially if that history saw them torn apart from their families. I don't know if I've answered that correctly, but I think going forward, we're making positive steps with really detailed family history studies, and circumstances. And Australian history is amazing, and I think you just need good storytellers to get that point across, and people will value it.
Thanks, Lara. Yeah, and I think too, the role that we have as heritage consultants working with the Indigenous communities in assisting the telling of stories and providing a platform, opportunities for those stories to be told, is really important, and there are so many opportunities that we do that. So, and
can I just jump in for Laurel when she says practical history? You just tell your friends that I guess the pyramids of Egypt don't really have a practical purpose anymore. They're still really, really impressive, and history does not need to be practical. It just needs to evoke something in you.
Thanks, Lara. I can't see that one. Oh, I see. Okay. I'm going to, it's tricky following this, Scott. Okay, hang on. I've got another question. This is from James. James asks, can we flip the equation? For an historian, what's the value of heritage?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. Because I guess we all bring our own idea into the equation. That's a really tricky sort of way to approach it. I guess because I've been working in heritage consultancy, I think history is integral to what we do with heritage. So I guess it's working out where they intersect. So how you tell a story and maintain legislative control and control conservation, control alterations, additions, and control that, but with reference back to, well, what's important about the place, what elements are important about what we're talking about in terms of the heritage of that place or that item or that landscape. It's a bit tricky because you've got different masters in the equation. So you're dealing not just with a client, you may be dealing with a government authority or another body. So it's a little tricky to actually get that. I think you can work out some heritage on the basis of, well, we're giving you an assessment of what we think is important about the place and what stories you could tell. But these are the modern sort of adjustments you have to make to actually make that that project happen in a certain way. I'm not sure if I'm answering that the way that James wanted. It's actually quite a difficult question, and maybe some of our senior consultants might be better placed to answer it from the heritage perspective.
It's a bit of a
sorry, Helen. Just jumping in. I think that's a great question. What historians are to heritage. In my kind of view, coming from a historical background, I feel as if history is kind of the basis from heritage, which it springs out, and often heritage in items, places, landscapes, etc., is what people interact with in their day-to-day life. So it's actually a vehicle for history to be presented to the public. So I feel as if history and historians' relationship to heritage is actually quite key for the whole equation. You can have a building which has historical fabric, but to understand why that fabric is important relies on the history. And I feel as if historians, not only in heritage but in other sectors, have quite a lot of value to give, and it's something that I don't think should be overlooked or dismissed. Yeah.
Thanks, Patrick. I could also add, I suppose, as an historian, that for me, the sort of emerging value of new heritage or new places that are newly appreciated as heritage is really important to me, because it demonstrates the changing appreciation of our past and the stories of the past that weren't traditionally valued. Heritage, back 30 years ago was a particular view of the world, particular kinds of buildings, brand, architect design buildings, and I think that changes continually into, much morphed into so many different things today. I think that's really important because it reflects the work that historians have done in bringing those places to light and those stories to light in the first place. So I'm just having a look. Any more questions? We've got some comments. Thank you for the positive comments. Okay. Question from Natalia. Thank you for the presentation insights. I wonder if you believe there is still a resistance on the practicalities of incorporating stories in heritage sites. Is there still a resistance? I don't know about that.
I think you do come across developers and owners that perhaps want to brush it under the carpet, so to speak. They want to do the minimum. They want to get their certificate. They want to get their approval. And I think, particularly in terms of interpretation, and I've heard my colleagues use this phrase, we just want a plaque. We just want a plaque. So I do think there is a sort of a portion of the community that just wants to do the minimum to get their project through, and they really don't appreciate what they have and how they could actually be getting an economic and a financial and a personal benefit for the long run from their community by doing more on the site. So yes, I definitely think there's resistance out there. People don't really understand what they have and what's important about their place.
Yeah, I feel as if that's probably one of the key issues about communicating the value of history, because that, you know, development is often the way that history is communicated in the buildings and places in our towns and cities. But it's with the, you know, it's emerging more and more that, you know, history does have a great economic benefit to places through economic and through cultural tourism, which is, you know, as I said, one of the values in the value of history statement. Better places that connect to their history promote better experiences and people coming back. And I feel as if it's, you know, part of our duty as people involved in history, as historians or as heritage consultants, as archaeologists, to communicate that benefit to people. How that is done is difficult. I don't have any answers on how to do it 100% of the time, all the time, but it's something, you know, worth thinking about.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I agree. There's another question I have from A. Cusmano, who's joining us from Perth. So that's nice to hear. I'm hoping, she says, he or she, to transition to a career in heritage here in Perth. So I appreciate hearing from heritage professionals. I would love to hear your thoughts about how communities can balance heritage and progress, inverted commas. So there is a conundrum, which we face a lot, and the perception out there of, you know, heritage is the sort of big ogre that's going to stop any economic progress.
I guess for that one, the word placemaking really helps, and you hear it a lot in talks of progress and development. No one's going to want to live in a suburb that's sterile. And how do you make that suburb interesting? It's placemaking. It's putting all the heritage into bringing it out. So it's just one of the key steps in building livable communities. So I think in terms of progress, if you frame it as cultural enhancement of a place, that's how they go together with progress. Yeah.
Thanks, Lara. Yeah, any other comments on that one? Heritage and progress.
I think there's some particularly fine examples, particularly work that GML's put out, and I'm sure down in Context, of really vital precincts which marry sort of new development and new uses with the stories of the site and fabric of the site. I think we recently won an award for the new Marrickville Library precinct, and I think these marry that beautifully. It's a little bit like Lara said, it's a bit of placemaking, but it's also providing a vital precinct and a way for people to sort of mediate between their world and the environment they're in. So I think there's a place to actually have those two work together. And I think if we communicate that with our clients up front and we're involved from the sort of the get-go, I think there's a better chance of getting a better result for the community and getting a better heritage resolution that marries that history and placemaking and viable economic livable space for the community to use.
Yeah, and I think perhaps sometimes the sort of character of a place that is sort of seeking to progress may not realise that the very character it has is the heritage, and if that's taken away, it's lost an enormous lot of value that can't be replaced easily. And often it's only when it's gone that people are sort of up in arms saying, oh, but you know, what's happened to that building? And I think there needs to be, I guess, a sort of a promotion of not just the aesthetics of the character, the physical character of the place, built heritage and the, you know, heritage landscape contributes, but also stories that are integral to what's happened in those places, and that actually gives identity, richness to an environment, to a community. Okay, there's time for a couple more questions. We've got one from Linda Roberts. He asks, interpretation has changed radically over the last few years. Have you found apps and augmented reality a positive? Does it engage a younger demographic? Linda from Canberra. I can't say that I have used augmented reality, but has anybody else? Anybody younger than me?
I've used augmented reality a couple of times in heritage experiences, and I think it does have its value in kind of improving an experience, but there is kind of I feel, you know, there's a tendency to go overboard with it. There's still, I think, probably interpretation is best presented when it's there and in a physical form, whether that be, as Leonie said, just a plaque or something more, you know, as in objects or spaces. I think augmented, you know, reality apps in interpretation can only ever enhance. They can't really make interpretation. So I feel as if, you know, you've got to start from the base, and then, you know, if you do have a client who is interested in kind of creating an enhanced experience, then you can start thinking about moving into those sorts of areas.
Mm. Yeah, so it's really exciting, and obviously that area will be developing a lot into the future. So something to watch. Okay, I've got one for another question. This is from Julian. Thanks, Julian. He asks, how do you think future generations will value all that's occurred in 2020?
Ooh.
Still in it.
Grief. I don't know. It's one of those times and events in history that everyone will remember. It's like everyone will remember where were they when the lockdowns went into place in March 2020. And I think it's more, I guess it's more in that sort of first responder perhaps area that there'll be some sort of concrete sort of history written because they're on the front line. But I know there've been also some people doing just community activities, photographing people on their doorsteps and their verandas. And hopefully that material, for me, that's that tangible fabric that will maybe end up in documentary collections in galleries and museums, and will be interpreted in exhibitions and walking tours in the future. It's just a continuum of events. We've had terrible events before. We've had the flu pandemic of 1918. We've had world wars. We've had these tragic events. So I think it's just another way of reading the history in a sort of a slightly tragic way, but also positive, because we're having positive outcomes out of improved hygiene, improved sort of communication. So I think there are some positives that will be part of that story that we tell in the future.
I think people value the lessons learned about disease control and prevention and spread, the seriousness, hopefully closing wet markets and things in China, and the environmental benefits. But I think the real value will come once we know what's going to happen next, because it's kind of almost like history's being, it's like I reckon it'll be like a new time period almost starting. That's how I see it, and that's what I think the significance is. It's like a new refresher. But hopefully it'll be okay. We'll
Hopefully.
Yeah.
I think despite all the economic doom and gloom, I think there is, as Leonie said, sort of some measure of significance in the way that people are valuing human stories and human courage, and I think it always sort of comes to the fore during those difficult times. And yeah, maybe gets back to sort of what's really important in that, you know, cliched way. And in that sense, I think it will value history. All history becomes more important because it is the story of human struggle. I feel like we are pressed to finish up now because it is 7 o'clock. And I'm not sure what happens if this is going to go. But anyway, I will close now. Unless anyone had something else. Patrick, did you want to just add something else then, or you're okay?
Just a little point about, people in the future. I think in some senses they're lucky as they'll get to relate to our experiences and experience none of the anguish and the pain that, we, especially Helen, yourself and other people in Melbourne might be experiencing. So lucky them, I say, in some respects.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, it's interesting. I'd just like to thank our three speakers, Patrick, Lara, Leonie, for your wonderful contributions, and thank you thanks also to Minna, who's in the background there, and I forgot to thank Minna at the beginning. Thanks, Minna, for setting everything up and being a great control room person. Thanks to everybody for joining us this evening. It's been great that we had a good turnout. Just like to finish by just imploring to our younger audience members, early career historians, to please pursue your studies in arts and your hope careers in history, because I think it is an area that will certainly be growing into the future, and it's a great area to work in. So we would encourage you all to pursue a career in heritage at GML and Context. Thanks very much, everybody. Good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night.